I didn't know then that the rules weren't about manners, they were about survival. And survival always comes with a price. The rules came before the paycheck. Before Ariel even knew where the brooms were kept, before she'd memorized the layout of hallways that stretched like held breath, before she'd touched a single thing inside that house, they handed her a folded card. White, thick, the kind of paper that costs more than her mother's copay. 4 rules on paper. No explanation. No or else, because the or else was implied in the weight of the man who handed it to her without making eye contact, as if looking at her directly might contaminate something. A 5th rule sat between the lines, unprinted and heavier than the ink. Obey fast or pay slow. She took the job because her mother's lungs were failing, and medical debt doesn't care that you're trying. It doesn't care that Ariel had applied to 43 other places in 6 weeks, that she'd smiled through interviews for positions that paid in exposure, that she'd watched her mother's face when the latest bill arrived, that specific stillness, the one that looked like peace but wasn't. The offer came through a recruiter she'd never met, for a household she couldn't find online, at a rate that made her read the number 3 times. Private residence, live-in, discretionary. The salary was the kind of number that fixes things, not some things, things. So she signed. The gates were the first warning she didn't take seriously enough. They didn't swing open dramatically, they just parted. Slow and certain, the way powerful things move when they have nothing to prove. The car she'd been picked up in smelled like leather and silence. The driver hadn't asked her name. She'd watched the city dissolve behind tinted glass until there was no city left, just a road that narrowed like a sentence reaching its point. The estate didn't announce itself. It arrived. 4 stories, white stone, windows that reflected sky so perfectly they looked like they were hiding it. Gardens trimmed to a discipline that felt aggressive, nothing wild, nothing accidental. Every branch submitting to a shape someone had decided was correct. There were men at the perimeter who weren't gardeners. She could tell by the way they stood, still in the specific way that means watching, not waiting. This isn't a home. Homes invite you in. This place measured you first, the way a weapon measures a target. The thought landed quietly, the way true things do. The housekeeper who walked her through orientation was a woman somewhere in her 60s, voice like a floor that doesn't creak, face that had learned long ago to give nothing away. Her name was Mrs. Cho. She did not smile. She was not unkind, not exactly, but warmth wasn't the point. The rules, she said, were non-negotiable. She tapped the same thick white card Ariel had been given at the gate, as if the paper itself was a contract. Never speak unless spoken to, and even then, sparingly. Never look directly at Chairman Seo. Never wander past the East Corridor after 7. Never discuss what you see inside this house. Not with family, not with friends, not with yourself, if you can help it. Ariel had nodded through all of them. Reasonable, she'd told herself. Rich people were particular. She'd known that. She'd prepared for strange. She hadn't prepared for Mrs. Cho's pause after the last rule, that half second of something crossing the old woman's face before composure swallowed it whole. Something that looked almost like an apology. And one more thing, Mrs. Cho said, folding her hands. Don't get attached to anything you find beautiful here. She said it like advice. Ariel heard it like a warning. She picked up her bag, followed the woman down the hall, and tried not to notice that the door behind her locked from the outside. Her stomach tightened, instinct screaming, but she swallowed it down the way poor people learn to swallow fear quietly, so it doesn't cost you the job. She learned to move like the mansion expected her to, quietly, efficiently, without disturbing the air. She kept her eyes low and her thoughts lower. She memorized which floorboards announced wait and avoided them. She became, in every practical sense, invisible, which is why it was so disorienting when he noticed her anyway. It happened in the library. She'd been dusting shelves that didn't need dusting, because Mrs. Cho had assigned her there, and assignments were scripture in this house. The room smelled of old paper and something woodier cedar maybe, or money aged long enough to develop a scent. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, a ladder on a rail, afternoon light falling in long, indifferent slabs across a desk the size of a small country. She didn't hear the door. She just felt the room change, the way pressure changes before a storm, not loud, not visible, but felt in the body before the mind catches up. Her hands slowed on the shelf. The back of her neck prickled. "What's your name?" She turned without meaning to. The rule said don't look directly, and she broke it inside the first second because the voice wasn't what she'd expected from a man whose name moved through this house like weather. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't commanding in the theatrical way of men who need to perform their power. It was just direct, quiet the way deep water is quiet. Seo Junhyuk stood near the doorway with his jacket undone and his collar open, one button too many. And there, just above the collar's edge, was the dark curve of ink disappearing beneath fabric. A tattoo, the beginning of something she wasn't supposed to see. His eyes were steady and dark and already waiting for her answer, as if he'd asked the question several seconds before he actually had. "Ariel," she said. Then, remembering herself, "Ariel Moon, sir." He didn't respond immediately. He moved to the desk, set something down. And then, as if the conversation had been a minor administrative matter and not the most unnerving 40 seconds of her recent life, he sat and opened a folder. But she noticed later, she would notice, that he'd looked at her the way people look at things they intend to remember. The shift in the house was subtle, not announced, not dramatic. But by the next morning, the guard who'd barked at her about a door she'd walked through too slowly said nothing when she passed the same door again. By the afternoon, a senior staff member who'd made a point of looking through her began giving her nods of hollow acknowledgement instead. Doors opened faster. Space was made. The invisible architecture of hierarchy had quietly rearranged itself around her, and no one said why. She told herself it meant nothing, that a man like Junhyuk managed his household the way he managed everything else, by calibrating variables, eliminating friction. She was simply a new variable that had been assessed and filed. She told herself that. She almost believed it. But that night, lying in the narrow bed of her staff quarters, with the rules card on the nightstand and the sound of distant footsteps pacing a floor above her, she thought about the way he'd said her name without saying it. The way he'd simply received it, like a piece of information he already knew what to do with. She thought about the tattoo at the edge of his collar, the beginning of something she wasn't supposed to see. She turned off the light and made herself stop thinking. The mansion breathed around her in the dark, slow, immense, and full of locked doors she wasn't supposed to approach. And Ariel Moon, who had come here for survival and nothing else, closed her eyes and told herself that curiosity was just another rule she could follow. She'd been following rules her whole life. She could follow one more. She should have known. Kindness, in a place like this, was never just kindness. It started small. A covered plate left at the edge of the kitchen counter in the hour before her shift ended, placed precisely where she'd see it, angled like it had always belonged there. No note. Warm rice, something braised, the smell of it so ordinary and so specific to comfort that she stood there for a moment, feeling disoriented. The way you do when something unexpected is also exactly what you needed. She ate it standing up. She didn't ask questions. The medical supplies arrived 2 days later. A small kit on the desk in her room: gauze, antiseptic, ibuprofen, the good kind of bandages that actually stayed arranged neatly inside a fabric pouch she could tell cost more than her last month of groceries. Still, no note. Still, no explanation. Just the wordless precision of someone who had identified a gap and filled it without requiring acknowledgement. Ariel sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the pouch for a long time. Then she put it in her drawer and told herself it was standard staff provision that the mansion maintained these things, that she was being naive, even noticing it. The shift in her duties came next, less of the back-breaking cleaning rotations, more of the interior work, quieter rooms, more reasonable hours, a revised schedule that someone had clearly adjusted, because it aligned perfectly with the medication window her mother needed her available for every afternoon. She hadn't told anyone about that. She hadn't mentioned her mother's schedule, her calls, the 15-minute window that mattered. She started paying attention differently. Junhyuk asked questions the way surgeons make incisions, with intention, without excess. He didn't make conversation, he made contact. Brief, precise, impossible to dismiss as politeness. "Did you eat?" In the corridor outside the east hallway, not quite looking at her, voice low enough that it wasn't a question for the room. "How's your mother?" By the window in the morning room, passing through, not stopping. "Are you tired?" Once, just once, said quietly enough that she could have pretended not to hear it, but she heard it. And what unsettled her wasn't the question itself, it was the fact that it sounded like it cost him something to ask. She started asking herself the harder question. How did he know? The mother, the schedule, the medical window. None of that was in her employment file. She'd been careful. She'd given the recruiter the minimum. She'd learned early that need was leverage, and leverage in other people's hands was danger. But he knew, and he wasn't using it. That was the part that disturbed her most. Not the surveillance, if that's what it was. Not the reach of it, the restraint. And the fact that whatever he'd learned about her, he'd converted not into control, but into quiet, specific care placed where she'd find it without ceremony, without expectation, without debt. She couldn't decide if that made it better or more dangerous. The warning came on a Tuesday. She was in the corridor between the kitchen and the staff laundry, carrying a basket, and he appeared from the opposite direction, like he'd known where she'd be and at what time, and he slowed just enough to speak without stopping. "This house isn't safe." That was all. He kept walking. She stood there, with the basket against her hip and the words landing in the center of her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She thought, "I know." She thought, "You're the reason it isn't." And then quieter, underneath that, in the place she hadn't given permission to, she thought, "Then why do I feel safer when you're in the room?" That thought she buried. Immediately, efficiently. She was here for the salary, for her mother's bills, for the specific, practical reason that she had no other option and needed this to work. She picked up the basket. She kept walking. She did not think about the warmth of the covered plate. She did not think about the medical pouch. She did not think about the way his voice dropped when he asked if she was tired, like tiredness was something he understood from the inside. She did not think about any of it. She was very, very good at not thinking about things. For now, she found him in the armory room. She wasn't supposed to be there, but she'd heard something, a sound that didn't belong to the usual nighttime grammar of the house, and she'd followed it without fully deciding to, the way you follow the scent of smoke before you've identified it as fire. He was sitting on a low bench, jacket off, left sleeve rolled to the elbow. The wound on his forearm was still fresh, a cut, deep but clean, the kind that looked like a knife and not an accident. He was holding a cloth against it without particular urgency. The way someone holds a wound when they're used to them. He looked up when she entered. Didn't tell her to leave. She understood that was its own kind of permission. She crossed the room, found the kit she'd noticed on a supply shelf. 3 weeks ago she'd cataloged it then, automatically, the habit of someone who moved through spaces preparing for contingency. She brought it back and sat on the bench beside him without asking, because asking would have given him the chance to say no, and she'd realized somewhere in the last few weeks that she was done pretending she felt nothing. Her hands were shaking slightly. She focused on the clinical task, the antiseptic, the gauze, and not on the warmth of his skin under her fingers, or the fact that he went very still when she touched him. Still in the way wild things go still, Not afraid, just registering. You should have called someone, she said. I did. She glanced up. He was looking at the far wall. She pressed the gauze, and he didn't flinch. She started rapping, and the silence between them changed texture, became less like distance and more like held breath. He spoke without prompting, low and even, like he was reading something he'd memorized and was deciding, sentence by sentence, whether to keep going. He told her about the house he'd grown up in, not this one, a different kind, smaller, louder in the wrong ways. A father who communicated in damage, a silence that was trained into him before he knew there was another option. He told her about the promise, the specific, structural promise. He was keeping the one that had required him to build an empire he'd never wanted and couldn't dismantle without destroying the thing it was built around. He told her about his mother, briefly, one sentence that contained everything. She didn't make it out. Ariel didn't say she was sorry. She didn't soften it. She just kept her hands steady on the bandage and let the words exist without rushing to fix them, because she'd learned early in hospital waiting rooms, in the kind of silence that lives in houses with sick people, that sometimes the worst thing you can do for grief is move toward it too fast. When he finished, he looked down at his arm, her work, clean, even, tight, without cutting circulation. You've done this before, he said. My mother, she said simply, and left it at that. He nodded, once. The way people nod when they understand something that doesn't need expansion. She began repacking the kit. He watched her hands. Ariel, she stilled. You understand what this place is. Not a question. What I am. Yes. And you're still, he stopped, started differently. You're not afraid. She thought about lying. She thought about the version of herself that had walked through those gates 6 weeks ago, card in hand, rules memorized, walls up and sealed and painted over. She thought about the woman who had told herself repeatedly and with commitment that she was here for a salary and nothing else. I'm afraid of the right things, she said finally. You're not one of them. He didn't respond. But something in the room shifted, something quiet and irreversible. The way tides shift, the way certain decisions are made, not in the moment of action, but in the moment just before it. When you know what you're about to choose, and you choose it anyway. She closed the kit. She stood. Don't get blood on the bench, she said, and left him there. She walked back to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and understood with absolute terrible clarity that she had just stepped across a line she hadn't seen until she was already on the other side. Understanding was how attachment started. She'd known that. She'd understood him anyway. The first time Ariel realized the mansion had ears, it wasn't because she heard someone listening. It was because she heard herself being discussed like an object that had already been priced. It happened in the service corridor, the one behind the kitchen that staff used when they didn't want to be seen. She was carrying linens, moving fast, keeping her head down the way she'd trained herself to, when two voices drifted through a door that hadn't latched properly. She should have kept walking. She didn't. She didn't recognize the first man's voice, but she recognized the second, one of the senior guards, the kind who never smiled and never joked, because his job wasn't to be human. His job was to be a lock. Eastgate, the stranger said. Midnight. A pause. The guard answered low. You're sure? Sure enough to get paid, the stranger said, and sure enough to keep your mouth shut after. Ariel's grip tightened on the linens until the fabric creased. Chairman Seo won't see it coming, the stranger added. That's the point. We hit fast. We take what we came for, and we're gone before the house even understands it's bleeding. The guard exhaled like he hated the words but loved the money. And the maid? The stranger asked. Not curious. Confirming. The maid stays out of it, the guard said. The stranger laughed once. Nothing stays out of it forever. Ariel backed away before the door could betray her with a sound. She walked on legs that didn't feel like legs anymore, more like borrowed scaffolding. She kept her face composed because composure was the only thing in this house that couldn't be taken from her without permission. In her room, she sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the rules card like it could tell her what to do. Never speak unless spoken to. Never wander. Never look directly at Chairman Seo. Never discuss what you see inside this house. Not with family, not with friends, not with yourself, if you can help it. She thought about her mother's face when the bills arrived. She thought about Junhyuk's blood-dark calm in the armory. She thought about the fact that he had warned her the house wasn't safe, like he'd been trying to give her an exit without saying the word leave. Her stomach turned. If she stayed silent, the ambush happened. If she spoke, she broke the rules that were keeping her alive. And then she realized the truth she'd been avoiding since the library. She was already involved. She had been involved the moment he learned her name and decided it mattered. She stood, walked down the hall, knocked on his office door. The guard outside looked at her like she'd lost her mind, which was fair, because she had lost the part of her mind that still believed invisibility was protection. A voice from inside. Enter. She stepped in. The office smelled like leather, ink, and control. Junhyuk looked up from a folder, and the air in the room changed, the way it had in the library, the way it always did when he was present. Ariel, he said, like her name was something he had already decided to keep. She swallowed. They're coming, she said. Tonight, Eastgate, midnight. He didn't move, didn't blink, but something in his eyes went colder, more precise. How do you know? I heard it, she said. I shouldn't have, but I did. A beat. And why are you telling me? His voice was calm, but the question wasn't casual. Because she could lie. Because she could protect herself. Because she could claim fear, or duty, or confusion. Instead, she told the truth. Because I don't want you dead, she said, and felt the sentence slice through her own chest on the way out. And because, if they take this house apart, they'll take everyone in it with them. Junhyuk stared at her for a long moment. Then he stood, crossed the room, not close enough to touch her, not yet, but close enough that she could feel him the way you feel a storm pressing against glass. Thank you, he said quietly. 2 words, no praise, no comfort, no softness. But in the weight of them, she understood something with perfect clarity. She had just broken the rules, and he was going to make sure she survived the consequences. She'd been asleep for maybe an hour when the first shot cracked the night open. Ariel was on her feet before she was fully awake, body acting on something older than thought, some animal architecture that recognized danger in sound before the mind could classify it. She stood in the dark of her room, breathing. The sound came again. Not one shot now, several. And beneath that shouting, the thud of something heavy, the alarm system catching up late, its wail cutting through walls like a second kind of violence. She should have stayed in the room. Every sensible part of her understood that. She should have locked the door and put her back to the wall and waited for whoever was going to come through the other side. Instead, she opened the door. The corridor was smoke and chaos and the wrong kind of light, a flickering, orange-tinted thing from somewhere down the hall that meant fire, which meant the night had multiple problems. She moved toward the stairwell because the stairwell was the exit, because exits were the only logical destination, because she was not a soldier and this was not her war, and she had a mother who needed her alive. She made it to the landing before the smoke thickened into something she couldn't see through. She stopped, cuffed, covered her mouth with her sleeve, tried to remember the layout east, west, the corridor that split at the second landing, and couldn't orient herself in the dark, and the noise and the weight of smoke pressing low. And then his hand on her arm, firm, immediate, certain, this way. She didn't question it. She let him move her, because in this moment, Junhyuk Seo, with blood at his temple and gun in hand, was the clearest thing in the building, and clarity was the only currency that mattered. They ran. He kept his body slightly in front of hers, not performing protection, not performing anything, just functionally inserting himself between her and the direction sound was coming from. The shot came from the left corridor. She didn't hear it the way she'd expected. It was less like cinema and more like physics, a sudden, brutal fact. And then Junhyuk was driving her sideways, behind a pillar, his body following through on momentum and covering hers as they hit the floor together, and the pillar above them took the impact that had been meant for something else. His breath was hard and close. Her face was against the floor, and his arm was across her back, and there was blood. She could smell it, feel the damp warmth of it through her sleeve, and she didn't know whose it was and couldn't tell. "Stay with me," low, right at her ear. She made a sound that meant, "Yes, and I'm here, and possibly don't you dare die in no particular order." He moved off her in stages, checked the corridor, moved again, and she saw the wound then. A dark streak across his left side, his expression giving it nothing, treating it the way he treated every inconvenience the world offered him, as something to be managed and moved past. She wanted to scream at him. She swallowed it. They moved, through a door she hadn't known existed, down a stairwell that smelled like concrete and old earth, out into a side courtyard, where 3 of his men were already forming a perimeter, and the sounds of the mansion above them were reorganizing themselves from chaos into something more controlled. He looked at her then, properly. His eyes went over her face, her arms, checking, and she realized he was cataloging damage, making sure she was whole. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice barely shook. He held her gaze a second longer than the assessment required. In that extra second, she understood it. Not as abstraction, not as feeling she could reclassify and file away. She understood it the way you understand things that have already changed you before you've named them. She was the thing that had made him reckless tonight. She was the reason his body had moved without calculation, without the cool tactical logic that ran everything else he did. She was the one thing that could make a Mafia king stop thinking. She didn't know if that was the most frightening thing she'd ever learned, or the most extraordinary. Possibly both. The courtyard was cold. Somewhere above them, the fire was being contained. His men moved around them, and between them and Ariel stood in the center of it, smoke in her lungs and glass in her hair, and a Mafia king bleeding quietly beside her, who hadn't let go of her arm since the corridor. She didn't ask him to. He looked smaller in the hospital bed. That was the thing no one warned you about. The way violence reduced even the most formidable people to the basic grammar of skin and exhaustion. Junhyuk Seo, who had moved through his own burning mansion with the calm of someone who had decided the outcome in advance, lay now with monitors at his wrist and an IV at his arm, and the particular stillness of someone who had finally been forced to stop. Ariel had not left. She'd told herself she would. She'd told herself that practical concern had a radius, and she'd been well outside it by the time they'd reached the hospital and been absorbed into the private wing where men in dark suits kept their positions in the corridor, and nurses moved with the efficiency of people who had learned not to ask questions. She'd told herself she'd leave. She was still there when he opened his eyes. He looked at her directly. No preamble, no adjustment period. "You stayed," he said. It wasn't surprise exactly, more like verification, like he'd believed it was possible and was now confirming it against reality. "You bled on me," she said. "I was already involved." Something moved across his face. She'd started to recognize that the way his expression shifted in small, precise increments, rather than making the broad gestures most people use to announce their feelings, it was the discipline of someone who had been punished early and repeatedly for letting things show. "Ariel, don't." She leaned forward. "Don't be careful right now. I'm too tired for careful." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, with the same directness he used for everything, no ornamentation, no performance, no easing into it like a man testing water temperature. "You're my peace," he said, "and my weakness." The words landed in the space between them and stayed there. She felt them the way you feel things that are both gift and wound, simultaneously. He didn't let her respond. He kept going because he was telling her all of it, she understood, in the specific way of someone who had decided to be honest once and needed to finish before the decision reconsidered itself. He explained the architecture of it, not the feeling, the reality, the way information traveled in his world, the way rivals operated, how they identified pressure points, how they applied force. He told her that the moment it became known she mattered, truly known, confirmed, beyond rumor, she became a target with a face and a schedule, and a mother whose address was not difficult to find. He told her the rule he was making, the one that cost him. Distance, publicly, formally, for now, for as long as now required. She would be a staff member. He would be the man who employed her. That was the world's version. That was the version that kept her alive. And privately? She asked. He looked at her like the question was the cruelest thing she could have asked, and also the only question that mattered. Privately, he said. You're the first person I've told the truth to in 11 years. She sat with that. She let it be enormous. She didn't try to make it smaller, or more manageable, or less than it was. Then she said, I hate this. I know. I hate that this is the only option. I know. And I hate that you're right. She sat back, looked at the ceiling, back at him. Don't mistake me taking the deal for me being okay with it. I wouldn't dare. It wasn't a smile, not quite. But it was the closest thing to one she'd seen on him, and it undid something in her chest, quietly and without warning. She reached out and adjusted the blanket at his arm. A small thing. A true thing. The kind of gesture that said, I'm here, without requiring the words, because words in this world had weights and witnesses and consequences. His hand found hers, briefly, completely. Then they both let go, and the distance began, and it felt exactly as terrible as they both knew it would. The man's name was Ro Chang-sik, and she learned it the way she learned most important things in this house, accidentally, and at the worst possible time. She heard it in a conversation she wasn't meant to overhear, through a door left open by someone who'd assumed she wasn't in the corridor. A name, and then a number, and then a phrase that assembled itself in her understanding, like a sentence she wished she could unread. Tell him the girl is the offer. She walked back to her room with her pulse loud in her ears and her face composed, because she'd learned that composure was the only armor available to her in this building, and she wore it the way soldiers wore Kevlar, not because it was comfortable, but because the alternative was worse. She knew what it meant. She wasn't naive. She'd been operating inside the logic of this world long enough to understand its grammar. When legitimate leverage failed, you reached for the thing that wasn't protected by guns or lawyers. You reached for the thing that was protected only by one man's restraint. And Junhyuk had shown his restraint, publicly, deliberately. He'd maintained the distance, the formality, the careful architecture of nothing here to see, and Ro Chang-sik had seen through it anyway, or someone inside the gates had helped him see. The attack on the garage came 3 days later. Professional, fast, not destructive. For its own sake, this was a message, not a massacre. 2 cars destroyed, a specific side entrance compromised, 3 of Junhyuk's men injured, but none killed, which meant the intent was demonstration rather than war. We know where she is. We know what she is to you. Come to the table. Or the next message won't be so polite. Ariel learned the details from Mrs. Cho, who delivered them with her usual economy of expression, face giving nothing, voice giving the minimum, eyes saying everything she'd spent decades training herself not to say out loud. Ariel listened, nodded, thanked her. Then she sat in her room and felt, for the first time in months, the cold specific clarity of being a bargaining chip. It was different from danger in the abstract. Danger in the abstract. You could think, around, over, through. This was different. This had a face and a number, and men who had looked at her existence and seen only its utility to someone else. She saw Junhyuk once in the 2 days after the attack, briefly, in the corridor outside the operations room, where men with tablets and quiet voices moved in and out with the energy of something being organized at scale. He looked at her and then away, the public version of him, the calibrated distance, and she understood it, she accepted it, and it still carved something out of her. What came after, she didn't witness directly. She heard it in fragments: a location, a meeting that wasn't a negotiation, an efficiency that the men in the corridors spoke about in clipped, approving terms. Ro Chang-sik was no longer a problem. The specifics of why he was no longer a problem were not shared with her, and she didn't ask. She'd made a private accounting of the line between knowing and complicity, and she was still standing on the right side of it, barely, but still. What shook her wasn't the violence. She'd braced for the violence. She'd understood from the beginning what lived beneath the marble, and the rules, and the covered plates left where she'd see them. She'd known the shape of it. What shook her was the moment he found her afterward in the garden, the private one off the east wing, where no cameras reached and no staff came after 6. He stood at a distance. He didn't close it. But he looked at her with all the restraint removed, with the public architecture stripped, with nothing between his face and hers but dark air and the specific weight of what they were to each other. And she felt it like contact, like he had crossed the room and placed his hands on either side of her face. "He won't be the last," Junhyuk said. "Not until this is over." She nodded. "I don't feel safer because you're gentle," she said. She held his gaze. "I feel safer because you're dangerous. For me." The garden said nothing. The night held. Something moved through his expression, not relief exactly, more like recognition, like she'd named a thing he'd been afraid was shameful and given it back to him as something else. He left without touching her. The distance held. But she stood in the dark for a long time after, and she understood that she was not the woman who had walked through those gates anymore. That woman had been negotiating survival. This woman was doing something much more difficult. This woman was choosing. The courtroom was its own kind of war, quieter, dressed in procedure and fluorescent light, and the theater of people pretending that words on paper had always been more powerful than the other kind of force. Ariel had sat in enough hospital waiting rooms to know the performance of institutional calm, the way spaces designed for high stakes borrowed the aesthetic of order to keep everyone's fear manageable. She wasn't afraid. She was something cooler than that. Something she'd found in herself over the months since the garage, since the hospital wing, since the garden, and the choice she'd been making, in increments, a clarity that lived beneath fear and outlasted it. She sat straight. She answered questions in complete sentences. When the opposing counsel tried to find the edges of her composure, tried to introduce instability with insinuation and implication, and the particular cruelty of questions designed to sound reasonable while meaning, "We think you're lying," she let it pass through her. She had faced harder rooms than this one. They tried to make her look unstable, infatuated, a woman who had confused proximity to power for complicity in it. They used the word relationship, the way people use tools trying to pry open something, create a gap, wedge a narrative into the space. She gave them nothing they could use. Not because she was hiding, but because the truth, clearly told, did not cooperate with their framing. She had cleaned his wound. She had warned him of a threat. She had survived a night of violence in a house she worked in. None of this was invented. None of it required embellishment. The facts were the most difficult version of events for the opposition to work with, because facts, unlike rumors, didn't yield to pressure. Junhyuk stayed out of the proceedings formally. But the case had been constructed the way he constructed everything, with the patience of someone who understood that power wasn't about the moment of impact, but everything built before it. Medical records, time-stamped security logs, witnesses, with no obvious incentive to cooperate who cooperated anyway. Digital trails that went exactly where they needed to go, and stopped where they needed to stop. He had built it like a siege, quietly, over months, while maintaining the distance, while keeping her unattainable to the world outside, while she sat with the specific discipline of caring for someone she could not be seen to care for. He had been working. He had been taking apart the structure that endangered her, piece by piece, in rooms she wasn't allowed to enter. She understood that now. She understood it fully. When the verdict came, not cleanly, not without appeals and procedural ugliness and the grinding machinery of institutions that protect themselves. First, she was sitting in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the courthouse. She had asked not to be told directly. She had asked for a text, 1 word, from a number she'd been given without a name attached. The word arrived. Done. She sat with it. She drank her coffee. She watched the street through the window and understood, for the first time in what felt like years, that she could look at the world outside without calculating its threat level. The life was hers again. The door she'd sold her freedom to hold open her mother's care, now funded and stable and no longer eating her alive, was all the way open. The debt that had driven her through those gates was cleared. The reason she'd come was satisfied. She could leave, cleanly, legitimately, with the integrity of a woman who had survived something extraordinary and walked out the other side without owing anyone anything. She thought about this carefully, the way she'd learned to think in that house, thoroughly, without flinching, looking at all the sides of a thing before deciding. She waited 4 months. She lived in a small apartment and called her mother every morning and slept without one ear trained to the sounds of a corridor. She worked a job that asked nothing of her beyond the work. She rebuilt the ordinary rhythms of a life that belonged entirely to herself and confirmed, methodically, that she was choosing from fullness and not from fear. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, she drove to the estate. The gates opened. They always opened for her, she'd been told, quietly, after everything, that the access code would remain on file. She hadn't known how to feel about that. She'd felt everything about it. He was in the courtyard. She wondered, briefly, if he'd known she was coming, if some calibrated system had told him, and he'd positioned himself there. Still the man who managed variables. Still the man who knew where she'd be before she arrived. She decided it didn't matter. He didn't move when she walked toward him. He didn't reach for her. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at her with everything he'd spent their entire history learning to contain, and contained none of it. She stopped close enough to matter. "I'm not here because you saved me," she said. Her voice was steady. "I'm not here because I'm afraid, or grateful, or because I don't have other options." She held his gaze. "I have other options. I've built them." He waited. "I'm here because I'm choosing you." She let that sit, deliberately, eyes open, knowing exactly what this is. He exhaled. It was a small thing, barely visible, but she'd learned to read the small things. She'd made a study of them over the long months of distance and consequence and quiet surgical questions in empty corridors. She'd become fluent in him. She'd done it the way she did everything, without meaning to, and then completely. He raised his hand and touched her face once, with the careful certainty of someone who had waited long enough that he was no longer capable of doing it carelessly, like she was something he intended to get right. "I know," he said. And Seo Junhyuk, who had built his empire on the architecture of control, who had learned, before he could read, that the world rewarded men who felt nothing and revealed less, let himself be loved. Not because he was safe, not because the world outside those gates had become gentle, but because she had chosen him with her whole self, freely, and some things even kings cannot refuse.